Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode brought to you from Strive Academic. Today's episode is on the Module A Advanced English rubric, Textual Conversations. If this is your rubric, you will note that this is basically a bit of a comparative intertextual study between a pair of texts. Once again, this is for advanced English students. Check in on my other videos to find the Module A for the standard English course. Today, I'm going to take you through the rubric, what it all means, what are some key terms, some ideas, and what ways to consider the rubric when examining your pair of core or prescribed texts. So, if you go onto NASA's educational website, you'll be able to find a copy of the Module A rubric, the A4-page copy. You might have even received it from your teachers already, but that's the starting point. If you hadn't had a look and read the rubric, I want you to take a moment now to jump online and access it and have a read. And when you come back, I will take you through the key points and key ideas. Okay, great. Now that you've had a read, I want to start with this idea of what is a conversation, because obviously the module is entitled Textual Conversations. So we need to establish what that is. So, in general terms, when you have a conversation, it's a dialogue between people in specific contexts. Now, usually we tend to think of it as the dialogue between people, in a shared or given context. And this is maybe where the rubric will delineate a little bit in that for some of these pairs of texts, they might be taking place in similar or shared contexts. With some of them, though, they might actually be taking place in varying contexts across time, across decades, and across different milieus or contexts. Now, ultimately, what it is at a basic level is the exchange of ideas and feelings. Okay, so when we converse, we're exchanging ideas, we're exchanging feelings, thoughts, notions, perspectives, aspects, and conversation is essential for our sense of being. It's how we maintain social ties and how we maintain our sense of humanity. So, when we're thinking about the different types of conversations we might have, they might be debates where there's opposing ideas or varying thought points. We might also have a discourse or something that's discursive, which has an array and opinions and perspectives being brought forward for consideration. We might also have a diatribe or a dialogue where perhaps with the diatribe it's something that's much more one sided, sorry, and might even be taken to mean as a bit of an attack or a bit of a rant, even. So if you're thinking about diatribe, thinking about that one-sided kind of perspective coming forth. Now, if we were to translate that idea of the conversation between your pair of texts in your study, the important thing to think about is, well, what is the significance of conversation within the text? What exchange of ideas, feelings, perspectives might be taking place? And also, why are they taking place? What might be the purpose? For that particular text, what might be their didactic intent, and what might actually be the context of the conversation as well. Okay, so some things to keep in mind moving forward with the module and its focus is that this is an exploration of a pair of texts. Okay, so it's a bit of a comparative study in that regard. You're making some intertextual connections between the two. So you want to be doing a few things when you start considering your pair of texts. One, you want to think about analyzing the dialogue that's occurring between the texts. So think about firstly, and I'll break this down further as we go, but think about what is the dialogue or the conversation or what messaging or perspectives are taking place in the earlier text or the hypertext and and what is taking place in the newer text. Is the dialogue that's taking place being reaffirmed or is it being challenged or reshaped in some way? The other thing you might want to consider is what is the type of creative energy and relationship that's occurring between the texts. So, what has shaped or inspired, sorry, each individual text, and also is the newer text or the hypertext being inspired in some ways by the older, by the latter, and then what new interpretations or insights is the newer text making based on the influence of context. Something that might help as well, think about the approaches in your pair of texts, is looking at literature as a sense of self expression. So, how is the author in each text using their form of literature in order to express themselves, to express their world, and to express their perspectives? And then you can actually look at that as a comparison. Is there a delineation in some way with these authors? Is it the same text type? Is the same form being used? Are they two very different text types? And the newer one is, adapting or appropriating the original text in a newer format or for different and new audiences. And so, lastly, you also want to think about the textual forms then being a vehicle to allow you as a young student, allow you as the modern audience to be able to access some of the contextual paradigms or the contextual forces or the zeitgeist or the milieu of that time, and looking at the key ideas that the author is presenting and considering how they're universal, how they translate as well to you as a uniquely modern young audience as well. And so if you look at those ideas that are universal, that are relatable, accessible, that might be your sort of starting point for developing your own approaches and responses in the future as well. So if you were going to ask yourself one question to wrap up, is your text type, or perhaps your pair of text has two very different text types, how are they serving as a form of expression for either author? And in what ways is the author exploring or representing their paradigm, their world, their context throughout their self expressive creative writing or creation tools in their textual form? All right, now let's get into some of the key terms in the meta language that we see in the rubric. And therefore, I've entitled this syllabus prescription. So, again, if you're unfamiliar with the rubric and you have not seen it yet, please access it. You can go on the NESA website. You can type in HSC English prescriptions 20, I believe, 19 to 2025 think, or 26, and you'll be able to see a document with all the different rubrics, and you'll be able to find your Module A Advanced Textual Conversations rubric there. Please take a moment, have a look, zone in, consider some of the key terms there and some key ideas being brought forth. Okay, now some key insights that we get from the rubric itself is that there's an emphasis on the terminology of resonances and dissonances between the texts. We'll look at that more deeply as we move on in this video as well. But looking at resonances and connections, and waves of connection, and looking at dissonances in terms of separations, newer perspective, a change, a contrast, even perhaps. The reimagining of text is something that also becomes emphasized in the rubric. You're looking at how perhaps the newer text has reimagined or appropriated or adapted or reshaped some of the messaging or the ideas or perspectives in that as well. And also looking at this idea of the relationship between the texts, I think that's one of the key things that I often take away when teaching Module A to my students is not only are these texts rich texts on their own right, but think about the power that we have in not only examining but relating to them when we study them in unison. Because then we have, for example, a deeper appreciation of perhaps the original text and the hypertext, and we might also then have a real sense of connection to maybe the more modern interpretation. And by examining both of them together and examining their relationship, we can then see how universal the messaging and the perspectives truly are. Universal to the point that you, as your student, will then hopefully be able to make your own connection. Now, you might see that I've got the terms hypotext and hypertext. That might just be one way for you to consider how you discuss the difference between the two. So, the hypotext being the earlier, and it really serves as the source for the newer text that you are engaging in with this comparison. So, it might be just some terminology that you could use in order to bounce between the two. And the really important thing with the rubric is the understanding of the influences. Okay, so because this is a module with intertextuality, we're looking at how each author in their different context and different time frame have been influenced by the ideas, the context, the values to then create the text that they've created. So it's really essential that for you to be able to connect on a deeper level with the works, that you understand the time frame, you understand the context. Have a look online at some videos that you can find, some news clips from certain key events that may have inspired your author. Take a look at even some interviews of the author, or interviews that have been done based on their original work. And reading articles is also a really great way to get in tune with not only what influenced the composer, but also the audience, how who they were writing for in that time, how they have taken on board the messages within as well. And so then the big kind of question here for you to reflect on and consider is why it's important to compare the texts. Not only to compare those specific texts, but what actually happens when we compare other forms of literature. How does the power of intertextuality start to come through as well? And we'll talk a bit more about intertextuality in a couple more minutes. Okay, so now that we've done a bit of a recap on the rubric, I'm going to take you through some essentials that you'll need to cover when you're actually exploring your text. Okay, once you start getting into the reading, the interpreting, the analyzing, there's a few things to look at: the subject matter, the response, the nature of the dialogue, and how the actual texts are conversing. So the first idea is the subject matter. Okay, so what is actually impacting the first work? What are the key concerns? What are some of the messaging, the intent, the purpose of the original work? And what you'll find is that in the hypertext, a lot of it might be influenced not only by societal context of the author, but their own personal context as well. So, first point is the subject matter. Then you might get into the response text. Okay, so how is the hypertext responding to their subject matter? Is it aligning with some of the points being made in the earlier works? Or is it actually, if we're looking at the rubric, colliding? Is there a delineation away? Or is there a reframing or a reshaping? So sometimes the idea itself is shared, the key aspect is shared amongst both texts, but perhaps the interpretation of that idea has shifted in that new text due to newer contexts. Then we move on to the actual nature of the dialogue. So this is where you have noted some connections. Okay, it doesn't mean necessarily that the newer text is exploring them in exactly the same way, but it might be that there's a key idea that's being explored. Even if there's changes, there's a key idea, or there's a key setting that's being explored, or a key moment, because it really depends on your pair of texts, or a key theme, or a key perspective, or perhaps even a key form technique or structural technique. Is there a motif that's being carried across? Is there some allusion, some metaphor? Your big intertextual techniques. So once you actually zone in on the nature of that dialogue, this is where you'll start to actually note the connections, or perhaps the changes. Whether there has been a collision in ideas, or if the author of the newer text has reframed the issue. And so once you start looking into the nature of this dialogue, you start to now get into your evidence. You will start finding examples of what did the you might say first, this is what the original author noted, or identified, or expressed, or explored. And then you might look across at your hypertext and you might say, this idea aligns in the hypertext, and produce some evidence. Or perhaps there is a reframing or a collision. You might introduce that. You might use your context to explain why. So, the nature of the dialogue, it's always important to consider the purpose, audience, and context of that to enable you to deepen the connections and the analysis. And then fourth is how the text converse. So, remember that in high school English, sorry, HSC Senior English, how is always language. How is language being used to shape and produce meaning? So you might be looking at big form techniques. If it's a poem, you might be looking at structural elements. If it's a prose fiction, you might be looking at certain genre elements. If it's actually the language itself, you might be looking at symbolism that has been brought across or motif. And then, obviously, within your specific examples, quotes, and evidence, you will have very specific techniques that go along with that, which also will help you to explain how the actual dialogue is taking shape. So think about when you are analyzing your quotes and your techniques, you're thinking and explaining how that technique has allowed for that reframing or that reinterpretation. What is the effect of that technique? What is the author's purpose in using, let's say, an illusion as opposed to just a straight metaphor? Thinking about that, it's all very deliberate. Okay, now that I've taken you through the basis of the rubric and given you some examples in how you might start to examine and analyze, you might now actually be thinking about, how do I maybe deepen my analysis or deepen my consideration of the rubric? And this is where you get into things like intertextuality, dialogism, some certain literary theory. Now, it's not a necessity in your work to include this, though some students do find it useful to do a bit of reading to understand on how this is taking place within their text. And they might find that when they understand intertextuality better or they understand what dialogism applies, they're able to more easily see it through their pair of texts or be open to discussing and identifying it when they're examining it in class with their teachers, or perhaps even when they're looking at it in exemplar responses. So, the rubric title of Textual Conversations really lends itself nicely to dialogism, which is when texts are in conversation with other texts and they're referencing and responding to them. And this contributes to the overall meaning. So, you will find when you're looking at your own comparative that there are certain connections in the both texts that are creating a bit of a discourse or a conversation, and usually it's your newer text that's responding or referencing the latter. And in the spirit of the rubric, all you're doing is making a consideration of when it's referencing and responding, is it doing so in a way that's creating a resonance and aligning, or in its referencing and responding, is it perhaps reframing? Is there a bit of a collision in ideas? So it's just another good way to ground yourself in where the spirit of this module comes from a literary background. And, if you want to do a bit of extra reading and look into Buckton's theory of dialogism, it's a very specific type of discourse here where the characters and particularly the newer texts of the character persona or straight just the author might be actually offering a variety of potentially contradictory points of view rather than just solidifying and aligning with all of the points from the latter text or the earlier text, I should say. So, when you are considering your text, it might be useful to think about where are they agreeing in terms of the newer text, where's the new text of the author agreeing or disagreeing? So what might happen is your newer text, your hypertext, might have some points where they align with the original author's works and points of view. However, because they are in a very different and new and more personal context, therefore their points of view might actually reframe and diverge or might actually contradict. It really depends on the set of works that you're looking for. You will find that most of the set texts for study, there'll probably be a combination. There'll be points of view that are aligned and brought forth into the newer context and the newer text, and there will be others that are a straight contradiction or disagreement. And lastly, with this video, I want to take you through some of the key rubric terms and some meta language that you will need not only to help you understand the rubric and to help you actually form your analysis, but also to help you respond effectively in an exam and in the HSC question that they give you. Because remember, the rubric is the most important thing we have to work out what the HSC exam will look like. Every question that is ever given in the HSC English exam comes directly from the rubric. So The more fine tuned our understanding is of the rubric, the more that you are able to reflect the rubric in your responses, the more holistic your response will be, and the stronger it will be in hitting an unseen question on the day. And it will actually give you a lot more room to work with and a lot of new things to discuss so that you're addressing the specifics of the question. So, just to quickly take you through, take some time to really put these in your own words, develop your definitions for them, and make sure you have that real key understanding. So, we've got align, assumptions, collide, conversation, dialogue, dialogism, debate, discourse, a diatribe, disparate. Got dissonance on there with the definition, intertextuality as well. Mirror, where text might mirror or align with the original, the paradigms or the context or the spirit of the age in which it's written, the perspectives, the points of view. And then you have, well, what is actually happening in terms of the dialogue? Is there a prolongation or an extension? Is there more of a reimagining or an adapting in a newer context? Or is there actually a reframing, a change in the original perspective? And what reflections or resonances or reverberations might there be as well? So I think as a starting point, it's really good for you to know these terms, have them, and then actually start using them, producing sentences with these when you start examining your text. So when you start looking at your very first text and you're looking at your purpose, your audience, and context, actually start thinking about for your first author, what are some assumptions they have about their world? What are assumptions you might have about their text? Um, in what ways is their paradigm being represented? What is their paradigm and context? And what perspective might they have? What is the purpose of their works? What are they trying to get across through the self-expression of their work of art, of their literature? Okay, and when you start with that and you have a few sentences going, you actually don't realize you're starting yourself up for some analysis there. And then when you read your hypertext, your newer text, then you can have a look. Does the paradigm mirror, or is there a bit of a collision or a difference? What is is there a debate happening, or is it more of a discourse? Are there similarities and alignments, and is there a reverberation of ideas? Or are there disparate ideas? Is there dissonance? And what has been reframed or reimagined? So you might think, okay, these are the key terms that, might be in the essay question, but don't forget that if you use them to drive your analysis, it will help you ensure that you are examining your text in the right way that, is kind of demanded of you with the HSC. So those things work hand in hand. Just don't forget your rubric is all I'm saying. Okay, thank you. Best of luck with your Module A Textual Conversations study.